The year was 1981. Our story begins in an absorption center in Jerusalem. A young Jewish American girl who had just emigrated to Israel couldn't help but notice a striking-looking woman, mother of 4 young children, looking regal in bearing, but her eyes told a story that she was intrigued to hear, and so she asked her if they could share a coffee together, and they did. And the story that she shared was this. She came from a very wealthy family in Iran, her husband a very successful businessman. Shortly after the revolution and the overturn of the Shah, her husband was murdered in cold blood. His blood splattered on the walls of his office as an accomplice of the old regime of the Shah. She realized that she had to escape Iran as quickly as possible. She grabbed her children and whatever few belongings she had, her jewelry, and whatever she could muster to take with her. She became aware of someone who helped people escape Iran through the mountains, through Turkey, and then onto Israel. What then transpired was the most harrowing 2 weeks of her life. Her and her young children spending 18 hours a day in the desert heat on camelback, and then freezing nights. The guide who was taking them across treated them in the harshest possible way, and every time they complained or buckled under the pain, he threatened to kill them, no less. Finally, after 2 weeks of this absolutely treacherous, harrowing experience, they came to Turkey, and before the guide took leave from them, he turned to them and suddenly, with a smile and in a soft-spoken tone, he said, "I want you to know that I too am Jewish, and you are heroes, but I had to behave harshly like this because otherwise you would never have made it across. And now may God bless you." And he took part from them. The story is a harrowing story, but with those words, the narrative changed, the context changed, and she was able to ascribe a different type of intent to this man who had so harshly treated them, a treatment that did leave scars both physically and mentally on her and her children. But nonetheless, with those words, while the story remained the same, the narrative changed. This distinction between a story and a narrative, which gives context to a story, is very much the sub-story behind what transpires in this week's Torah portion. When Yosef discloses his identity to his brothers, and what unfolds is nothing short of amazing, the graciousness of his spirit. However, upon close examination of the text, as Rabbeinu Bechaya points out, we do not find the actual words, "I forgive you," from Joseph, nor do we find the brothers seeking explicit forgiveness from him. What Yosef does tell them is, "You had malintent towards me, but God had a different plan, and this was all orchestrated by him, that I should be the sustainer of my family." And so what Yosef did was, he acknowledged the pain of what had been wrought upon him, but he did not allow himself to be victimized by that. He didn't wash away what had happened and pretend like it didn't happen, but rather he understood that what happens is ultimately the will of God, orchestrated by him. And the truth is that the brothers were punished for what they did. But many, many years later, in fact, 1,500 years later, as we read on the Yom Kippur liturgy of the Musaf, the 10 holy martyrs who were murdered by the Romans, those 10 holy sages, among them the famous Rabbi Akiva, were incarnated souls of the 10 brothers. And their death at the hands of the Romans was the ultimate consequence for what the brothers had perpetrated against Yosef. So they were not exonerated for what they did, but Yosef had the strength of character and perspective to see the hand of God at work. We find a similar story with King David, who, in the midst of a rebellion staged by his own son, Shalom, no less, had to escape the palace. And he's with a few loyalists by his side when he encounters the head of the Sanhedrin, Shimi ben Gera, who curses him, cursing the king. King David's loyal aide, Avishai, says to King David, I shall behead him for his curse of the king. And King David says to him, do not touch him, because it is God's will that I be cursed. Now here too, at the end of his life, Shimi ben Gera was held accountable for cursing King David. But King David understood that the fact that he was being cursed by now was being orchestrated by something higher than the cursor himself, Shimi ben Gera, who was just a mouthpiece. So the story doesn't change, but the narrative does, and gives it a completely different layer of understanding, and the realization that nothing that happens in the world is random, but rather the net results of things are orchestrated by God and need to galvanize us into asking ourselves, how do we move forward from here, while at the same time recognizing that what happened, happened, and it's real, and we're not going to pretend like it didn't happen. But what happened is all orchestrated by God. Those who did what they did with malintent will be held accountable by God. At the end of the day, there is justice. But the net result is part of the divine plan. This is particularly relevant as well for the 10th of Tevis, which is the fast that we are observing this Friday for the siege of Jerusalem that led to the destruction of the temple, which our sages say was a result of baseless hatred. Now, this idea of baseless hatred itself can do with some unpacking. Do people really wake up one morning and ask themselves, who can I hate today? Most people hate because they feel victimized by someone. Now, sages tell us that that's baseless. You know, why is that baseless hatred? Why? This person did something with malintent towards me, or maybe even worse. Why is that baseless? Why? Because the net result of what was inflicted upon me is all part of God's will. As our sages tell us, one who angers is guilty of idolatry. Now, what is the connection between anger and idolatry? The answer is, our sages tell us, that anger means I have divorced God from the circumstance. I'm pretending like the world is random, and this should not have happened. That's why it's tantamount to idol worship. And so, the fast day of Asar B'Tevis is a reminder to us that in life, we need to spend less time harboring negative feelings towards those who have inflicted things upon us, while at the same time not calling for forgiveness, but more like Joseph's attitude towards his brothers. You did what you did because of your bad intent, but here is how we're going to move forward as a family. Here is how we're going to flow with God's plan for us moving forward. And may we all be blessed to have the strength and the power and the perspective to always see the hand of God in everything that we do. And may it always be outwardly positive and not have to be challenged to pierce through the layer and ascribe a different narrative. May the story always be a beautiful story. Wishing you Shabbat Shalom. Thanks for joining us.